good evening and welcome to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Niresh Seliathambi. Well, our country is looking forward to a strong economic showing in 2025. We are hoping for it and we expect it with this new government in office now. We're all waiting for the budget, which should come in a few weeks' time. So all eyes on the government and, of course, the economy, which needs to really take off if this country is to be successful once again. But what of the workers, all those young men and women, and not so young men and women, who toil hard in many industries around the country, from whom much is expected because they bear the burden of the economy on the ground. So what do they want from this year, 2025? And to discuss this, we have with us Miss Swasthika Arulingam, attorney at law, and of course she represents the People's Struggle Alliance. Welcome, Swasthika.
Thank you, Niresh, for having me.
Good to have you once again, the first time for this year, of course. Right, so let's talk about the workers' side of things. And with the NPP in power, much is expected from the workers of the NPP. So what exactly are the major areas that you are looking at, you of course being a representative of one of the major workers' parties?
That's correct, Niresh. I think one of the reasons why we expect a lot from this government is because we know that workers also overwhelmingly voted for this government. And one of the reasons why they voted for this government is because the unbearable cost of living and the fact that people could not live anymore. So that expectation is very much there in this government. Soon as the government came to power, various incidents happened, which as the People's Struggle Alliance, we raised concerns, particularly with regards to the debt restructuring agreement which Ranil Wickremesinghe entered into, which was approved by which was followed by the NPP government, and so on. So we raised concerns on the terms of the debt restructuring agreement. But in terms of workers, one of the serious concerns we have is in terms of wages and in terms of workers' welfare. Wages, because for instance our national minimum wage right now, when we take the budgetary relief allowance and everything, it's 21,000. So if we look at what the central bank is proposing, when we look at the statistics and numbers, we come to around 59,000 as the national minimum wage. If you look at the central bank figures and the census and statistics figures. So you see a huge disparity between what is law and what is actually approved as what is actually we need as minimum wage. So these are the things which we are raising as trade unions. These are the things which we are raising as a political party. And I hope that we have, in fact, I'm also the president of the United Federation of Labour. So we have submitted proposals for the budget to this government, and we hope that this government will take these proposals into consideration in preparing the upcoming budget, presenting the upcoming budget.
Now, absolutely, with the budget being prepared even as we speak, and it takes a team of professionals to do that at the Finance Ministry, and they do get a lot of suggestions, feedback, comments on policies and so on. So they do take these into account, and then of course they prepare the budget. So this is the time when organizations and individuals as well as private sector companies need to actually make their recommendations and requests on a rational basis, of course, to the Finance Ministry. And in fact, usually there are newspaper advertisements as well, which the Finance Ministry puts out, calling for such requests and so on. Now, when you look at the national minimum wage, Swastika, 21,000, I mean, that's just laughable. It's ridiculous. I don't know any industry which stays at that level. So even private sector, state sector, everybody realizes this is far too low and it needs to be a lot higher, or significantly higher, in order for people to have a living wage and something which they can live off of. We're not talking lakhs and lakhs. We are simply talking about the
basic minimum.
A basic minimum across the board.
Yes.
Which, I mean, we're talking a national minimum wage, not per industry. You know, different industries have their different wages boards as well. But this is the national minimum wage. But we never hear about this national minimum wage either. So basically, it's something which it exists, but it is irrelevant because it is so far removed from reality, isn't it?
I think the issue of wages is often spoken about, particularly with regards to the private sector and also the state influenced by private interests. It's often spoken about in relation to productivity. And what is interesting about this argument of relating wages with productivity is that if I was a machine, if I was a vehicle, no one would expect me to run unless I am fueled. Without fuel, no one would expect me to run. But what happened with workers is that I think we have trained ourselves to think that unless the worker performs to a certain degree of what the company requires, we do not have to pay the worker. And that is a very, very dangerous argument, because it's essentially saying even if the worker is not eating, even if the worker is not living a bare minimum, it does not matter, it does not concern us. You still have to produce this much, you still have to pluck this amount of tea leaves, you still have to produce this amount of garments, and so on. And this kind of toxic way of thinking has resulted in very, very poor wages, whether it be the export sector, where you find wages between anything between 26,000 to 40,000. And then you find the plantation sector, which after much struggle, last year we know of the drama which happened where they said they're going to increase the wage to 1,700, then it was brought down to 1,000 again, then it was increased to 1,350, and so on. So we are going in this cycle where workers are forced to produce in order to get a basic wage, which is hardly enough for them to eat and survive and send their children to school and so on. So we go around in this very, very vicious cycle where people are kept at a certain level because they are not earning enough to live a bare minimum life. So I completely agree with you when you say that when we say 59,000, it looks like a big number. This is the numbers which our own government, our own state is producing and saying, this is what we need for people to survive. So if our own numbers are saying that, then the question is, why aren't we moving towards policy where we are able to pay this number so that people can live a bare minimum decent life?
Now, Swastika, when it comes to countries like the United States, UK and so on, there is a minimum wage and it is a livable one. It's nothing fantastic. In the US, if you're making minimum wage, that's barely enough to get by, to live off of. You can pay your rent and food and medical as well, but that's pretty much it. But at least you can live off of that, and then of course if you get into a better profession, then you find productivity allowances and so on, but that is above the minimum wage. So here what you're saying is that the minimum wage is not livable, and instead there's a minimum wage plus productivity allowances in order to survive. So but what is the solution here? If you can take us back a little bit on how this minimum wage came about, and why it is not revisited every year, because we are a country where inflation is rampant. Right now, thank goodness, it's under control. It's pretty much at zero. But when you look at over the past 10 years or 20 years, we can see that inflation it's huge. It's we had 80-90% inflation just a couple of years ago. So obviously the minimum wage also needs to change every year, don't you think?
Two things, Niresh, just observing from just giving my observation on what you said. US doesn't have the best standards in terms of labor. This kind of changed during the Biden administration, but with the Trump administration coming in, we are not sure where it's going to go. And because their labor standards are at a very minimum level, and US also have been blocking certain ILO conventions, it's because of that that even in Sri Lanka, because our economy, our biggest export destination in terms of garments is the US. So because of certain labor policies which exist there, that also directly affects countries like Sri Lanka in terms of us being able to pay workers and so on. So US is not in terms of, because they also don't have free health, free education is only for a certain category of people and so on. So in that sense, I think up until recently, up until maybe 10 years ago, we have been performing much better in terms of social and economic indicators when compared to the US. But in terms of what has happened to us is that Sri Lanka has been a country which has worried or which has been concerned about worker welfare, the welfare of people and so on. For instance, we were one of the first countries to bring social and economic indicators into our constitution by way of directive principles of state policy. So that is where we started. But eventually what happened is we were influenced by various ideas and even international financial structures, like for instance the IMF and World Bank, and then we started moving towards, from a socialist government, we started moving towards not liberal government but neoliberal government with the JR administration and so on. And I think that trend is what we are seeing now in terms of the decaying social and economic indicators even in this country. We were a country which almost had a very, very low maternal death at childbirth, but these indicators are now changing. So this is quite worrying for countries like Sri Lanka. But in terms of what you're asking, what I would say is that it's not impossible for us to go back. It just takes a lot of political will, an absolute political will, for us to think, where do we want to invest? Do we want to invest in our workers? Do we want people in this country to think Sri Lanka as a country where they can live in? We know of the migration situation, like we know that the situation is so bad that the government is now exporting workers to even countries like Israel, when the country is at state of war, where there is no safety for our workers. We are taking the space of Palestinian workers. So this is where our country is at. Our workers are being trafficked to the Russian-Ukraine borders. So this is what we are seeing right now, right? So if we want to change that, if we want people to not be so desperate that they end up in warring countries to work there, then we have to make the situation better. In terms of your question on minimum wage, this is not, or rather, I won't say minimum wage, I would say living wage, because a wage is something a person should be able to live with. This is a global debate which was happening. Initially, it was minimum wage, because there was, before the minimum wage concept came in, there was no kind of restriction on what the private sector, particularly factories, large-scale factories, can pay. So then there were struggles by unions, there were struggles by workers, and they decided that we need to give a certain minimum wage in order to ensure that people don't get exploited below that. But what happened was corporate lobbies, private interests and so on managed to continue to lobby to keep minimum wage at a certain depressed level, so that, as you very correctly said at the start of the interview, the national minimum wage is so irrelevant that no one, absolutely no one, can live with that national minimum wage. So these are the debates which happened globally when a minimum wage was brought in. That there was a global movement to keep wage at a certain level so that workers don't starve, workers can have a decent living. But corporate lobbies managed to suppress that minimum wage beyond a certain level. And then what happened was unions and workers started speaking about this concept of living wage. where we said that if you get a wage, you need to be able to live with that wage. But living wage is essentially what we are saying is the minimum wage of the country should be the living wage. It's not two different concepts. The minimum wage of the country must be also the living wage. Someone should be able to live with the wages he's receiving. And that is essentially what unions and workers are saying.
So one of the reasons for brain drain at the lower levels, Swasthika, is this issue where people they come out of school and then they get jobs, and they're happy to simply get a job, but then 6 months down the road they realize this money is not worth anything, and then they're not working hard anymore. They don't want to learn. Sri Lanka is a managerial nightmare when it comes. If you're a manager, you're constantly struggling to get more out of your workers, out of whatever industry, simply because the environment, the financial environment, is very poor. And this boomerangs on whether it is a state institution or a private institution. Within about a year, soon as that worker has got trained and got some experience, off he or she goes to another company to try to increase the salary, and then every year or two people jump from one company to another. And this is there at the lower levels, and it is also there at the higher levels. People move from one bank to another, from one hotel to another. So it's very difficult to get that. When we say brain drain, it's knowledge, isn't it? And the knowledge that you are instilling in your workers is gone in a year. So then you're back to getting a new person and training all over again. So even when we talk of foreign companies setting up here and transfer of technology, well, who are they going to transfer it to? They transfer it to workers who are then gone in a year or two. So then the transfer of knowledge, it comes to nothing. So all this is very interconnected, isn't it? Because our economy simply is very weak when it comes to human resources.
I think the phrase "economy is very weak" is a very important phrase. I think because up until 1970, the burden of constructing the economy was almost solely on the government. We were a closed market economy, right? So it was solely on the government. After 1970, our state, for whatever reason, took a policy decision to move towards free market economy, and in fact a neoliberal economic model. And across the world, the neoliberal economic model has failed. But leaving that aside, Sri Lanka as a country, we moved towards a free market economy. So then at that point, the burden of the economy, I would say 60 to 70% fell on the private sector companies and so on. So when the burden of a country's economy falls on the private sector, what we are expecting is the private sector to act in public interest, which doesn't happen anywhere, but that is essentially what is the argument, that the private sector would act in public interest. But of course, what we have seen in Sri Lanka and across the world is that the private sector is not about public interest, it's about profit driven and so on. And the height of that in countries like Sri Lanka is what we are seeing is that the profits which are obtained through various subsidies and so on in the private sector is not retained in small economies like Sri Lanka. It's kept abroad, it's kept in offshore accounts and so on. And that is what 2 years ago the United Federation of Labour raised the issue of misinvoicing, transfer pricing and so on. The central bank to date has not given a response to us. I think there's a report which came out a few years ago by Global Financial Integrity, and they said in countries like Sri Lanka, nearly $40 billion have been transferred out of the country. So when wealth is being transferred out of a very small economy like Sri Lanka, then obviously the economy starts shaking. When the economy starts shaking, we're all living inside that economic environment, in the economic condition. So then people also start getting destabilized. People also start getting disturbed. People also start moving from job to job, hoping that they would get better income in another job. And when that happens, what you were saying, knowledge, there is a brain drain, there is no knowledge retention, there is no institutional knowledge, and then people at the top level of corporates also struggle to build and to retain knowledge and so on. So this is like a cycle. So that is what I always say, is that an economy is we can debate over whether we need to have a state controlled economy or a free market economy. But I would say an economy in this day and age should be a balanced economy, where the state must oversee, a state which is accountable to the people because it is elected by the people, like what we saw in the last election, has control, and actual control, not superficial control, but actual control over how the market is operating in a country. And in countries which have done that, for instance, like South Korea, we have seen drastic improvement in terms of country's economy, in terms of country's social economic indicators, at least for a certain period of time, substantial period of time.
Well, now let's discuss how this affects. Let's take a particular industry, IT industry,
Yes.
Of which much is expected. Every political party during the last election cycle, they were saying we need to have the IT industry as one of the industries which will allow Sri Lanka to take off. But when you really dig a little deeper, you realize we don't have IT professionals in numbers where a foreign company would want to come and set up shop here. Because we're talking about a foreign company comes in, needs 10,000 IT professionals. They don't have to. They don't need to have IT degrees, but perhaps some kind of diploma, 6 months or a year diploma. But we don't have even that in sufficient numbers. Whereas if you go to India, if you want 100,000 IT workers, you got it, right?
Yeah.
Or Malaysia. But here, if you want even 10,000, you can't get it. And what is happening, what we have seen, is that especially in the IT industry, these young men and women, they qualify with a diploma, maybe a 1-year diploma, and then they go overseas. And they're working at low-level jobs with very little career prospects, whether it's in the Middle East or wherever. In fact, many of the people who were trafficked to Myanmar, to those slave labor camps, and fell into deep trouble, are actually IT workers. They were promised IT jobs and sent to Thailand and then driven across the border to Myanmar. I mean, we at Newsfirst took up that campaign in a big way, and we found that yes, a lot of them were finally rescued and released and brought back, but a lot of them are actually IT workers. There were a few graduates, but mainly they are people with these diplomas. So this is an issue where even if you have some qualifications, you can't find the jobs in Sri Lanka which will pay you a living wage. It just comes down to that one.
I think the trafficking incident which happened, particularly in Myanmar, and the recent incidents which are happening, is just I would say a symptom or an indication of the economic health of this country, that people would pay any amount, people would trust anyone just to get out of this country. But leaving this current predicament we are in, if you just look at the way our education system has worked in the past, I think we have had free education, and a lot of energy has been spent on critiquing that free education rather than talking about how do we expand that free education and how do we expand quality free education, which I would say would have resulted in more IT professionals coming into our country. And government can have programs. I mean, in countries, there are other countries where governments would have professionals and they would have government policies to policies of migration in terms of professionals and so on, doctors. There are certain countries, where doctors are given to other countries for servicing and so on. So Sri Lanka also can do that, or would have been able to do that. But unfortunately, I think we spent a lot of time, particularly at the policy level, we spent a lot of time critiquing the education system rather than seeing how do we invest in specific areas where we could have resulted in, better human resource or better qualified human resource and so on. So the debate should not have been about privatizing education. It should have been about how do we make education, one thing, more accessible, because we are still talking about schools in countries like Sri Lanka, where we don't have in certain areas in Sri Lanka, where we don't have proper tables and chairs. We have seen those pictures where students come and sit, with umbrellas to write examinations and so on. We have seen these pictures on social media. So we have to talk about expanding free education, but we also have to talk about investing in quality education. But the debate has been about privatizing education, and the people who are pro free education have been responding to the privatization arguments instead of coming together and talking about quality education or investing in certain sectors which would have benefited Sri Lanka.
Swastika, when you say quality education, it's basically what we are teaching these youngsters, isn't it? For example, around the world, there are immense job opportunities for drivers, especially drivers of heavy vehicles. Right now in the UK, they're facing a dearth of heavy vehicle drivers. But in many other countries, driving is something which is taught in high schools, or in these right after high school they can go and get do a driving course and a proper course and get some experience and the qualifications. But in Sri Lanka, we really don't train our drivers, do we? It's not taught in schools, and they just come out, and we have hundreds of thousands of youngsters who are driving three-wheelers, and they've never learned how to drive safely, not to drive a three-wheeler, and they don't know how to drive on the road, and they certainly don't know how to drive a bus or a truck. In fact, one of the disasters which took place a couple of months ago, where a bus fell down a precipice and several people were killed, the driver's license had been suspended because of infraction. So clearly the quality in education and training is simply not there, and these are practical skills, aren't they? I mean, how to drive, how to be a personal assistant, a secretary, how to do a basic salesman or sales girl job. These are not taught, but these are things which can be taught very quickly within 3 months or 4 months. So why aren't we focusing on those? Why is it that our education system at all levels is simply looking at more obtuse academic things and not focusing on these practical aspects? Drivers, carpenters, electricians, we simply don't focus enough. I know some institutions like NITA, they do a fair amount of work, but certainly the numbers aren't there.
I think I'm not an expert on education policy, but I am aware of the debates which has been happening. So there are few issues which you raised, it touches on so many aspects. So I will just go through one by one. One is this, what you're saying about, why don't we have drivers? Why don't we have IT professionals and so on? What you're saying is essentially we don't have these professionals because we are not investing enough in education, and that is what I said. The debate has always been about privatizing education, privatizing education, but quality education costs, and the state should take onus of that burden, unless of course we want to have a country full of untrained or uneducated people. And we are a country which took that responsibility at a certain time, but down the lane we started focusing on privatizing education and so on, and most of these private education institutions are registered as companies. So what we are saying is the ethos of this country is making education into a profit making venture, When you make education into a profit-making venture, then we are going to see all of what you're saying. We are going to have untrained and unqualified people in this country, which is not going to help this country. So that is one thing where we need to seriously talk about state investment of education and talk about it which as if it's much needed for this country, rather than talk about it as if, oh my God, the taxpayers' money, as if, we are throwing charity at schools. This is not charity. This is investment for the country's future. So that's one thing. The second thing which you spoke about is the debate which happens between arts education and technical education, science and math education or technical education, IT education versus arts education. I think the education system has to be a combination of both. And I'll tell you why. If you just train someone on science and maths and completely leave out humanities, that person will not have critical thinking. That person will not be trained to think with empathy. Without empathy, without critical thinking, without being able to understand how certain things work in this world and society, however much you are trained in IT, however much you are trained in science, you will lack the empathy to use it correctly. And this has if you look at global history and so on, this has always had, a dangerous trend. For instance, if you look at Germany during the Nazi era, we had very trained scientists, we had trained mathematicians and engineers. But what happened to that country? There was no empathy, there was no discussion on ideology and how these technologies and how this knowledge should be used. If you take, for example, the AI debate which is going on, the artificial intelligence debate, how artificial intelligence should be used, to what extent should be used. These are the things which humanities teach. So I think the education system must be a combination of both. In terms of the driving issue which we're talking about, apart from the fact that I have my huge doubts as to how certain people are getting their license and so on. Let's leave my biases aside, observations aside. But in terms of accidents, and this is something which we have been talking about, is that road accidents are increasing in this country because trishaw drivers, bus drivers are trying to drive really fast. The reason they're trying to drive really fast is because the money which they're getting from one hire or one bus route is not enough for them to survive. So this once again ties back into the economy. Comes
right back to the wages
to the wages, to how the economy is constructed and so on. So of course we can penalize, trishaw drivers who are trying to cut short and get to their destination. And of course we must penalize, because otherwise, pedestrians are going to be in danger and so on. But increasingly I am watching, because I take the public transport, I see buses, overtaking, buses speeding, which is going to be very dangerous for pedestrians on the ground. And if we have to stop this, either we have to, once again, we come to the question of investing in public transport, investing in transport safety, and investing essentially in public transport. That is the only way we're going to cut, people speeding to get their next whatever hire or so on.
Hold that thought, because we need to take a short commercial break. We are in conversation with Swasthika Arulingam. We'll be right back after this break.
මොකද නෝන් වෙලා තියෙන්නේ?
කටින් සෙමෝගේ ඇවිත් තියෙනවා මිස් කතා කළාට කිසිම රෙස්පොන්ස් එකක් නැහැ.
ඒක නිසා මුදලාලි උන්ට මතක තියාගන්න මට මහත්තයා කියන්න කලින් මහත්තයා කියන්න ඕනේ තරම් මහතුරු මේ රටේ ඉන්නවා කියලා.
ඔයාලගේ සර්ට ඩිමෙන්ෂියා තියෙනවා නේද?
අම්මේ ආච්චි කියනවානේ මට එදා බොක්ස් එක ඇතුලේ තාත්තගේ ෆොටෝ එකක් තිබ්බ මතකයි කියලා.
ඔය ෆොටෝ එක කියන්නේ නිදානයක්. අපේ ජීවිතේ දේවල් ලේසි කරන, අපේ රස්සාව ලේසි කරන.
රස රහසක්.
හෙට රාත්‍රී 7:30ට
සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්.
Welcome back. We're in conversation with Swasthika Arulingam. Now, Swasthika, we were discussing various aspects of what workers want and need. But with the budget coming up, what should the government be focusing on? A, for the macro situation of economic progress, and B, to support that, what do the workers need done? Now, we discussed minimum wage. What else needs to be done where should the government's priorities be in investment of the very little money that the government seems to have?
I think we should focus on a few essential things. Food. Government has to invest in food because we are looking at rising malnutrition, particularly during the COVID and the economic crisis. So we are looking at protracted cases of malnutrition, right? So invest in food. Health and education, which we have had a long, strong tradition of investing. Unfortunately, in the last maybe 2-3 decades, this has been declining. So the government should focus on that, as well as transport. Because if the government invests in these important aspects, and where we're going to get the money from is something which we can discuss. If the government is going to focus on or refocus on these 4 aspects, then I think workers also can survive in wages they are getting. So the fact that the government is going to invest in these 4 matters, it's also in effect would help people live at lower wages. If the government is investing, if for instance food is given at a lower price, if there is proper free health and education so that the parents don't have to take their children to tuition classes, if there is affordable transport, then workers can live in wages in wages which they are getting. But it's just that the wages are so low, and then the cost of living has gone up, and the wages don't really match up to the cost of living, and that is why workers are struggling to survive. So I think government must invest in this. Where the government can get the money, this is something which we come and speak about in all programs. One is military expenditure. Sri Lanka has always allocated the highest for military expenditure for a small country like Sri Lanka. I don't know why we need to allocate that amount for military. So that is one thing. And the other thing...
Boys love guns.
Yes, and that has cost us.
That is the be-all and end-all of it.
That has cost us.
Young boys, young men, they love guns. And it's the sign of an immature society when you have hundreds of thousands of young men, the best, the creme de la creme of your youth are sitting around idling in military camps instead of being out there working. So it's all about a little bit of male ego, or a lot of male ego, which is why you have these immature societies which basically spend a lot on weaponry, which is hardly ever used. I mean, we are not at war, we're not likely to go to war. But as you said, the military is a huge drain on financial resources of the state and human resources of the country. So, as you have pointed out repeatedly, the military budget, which is the largest budget of any ministry in this country for decades now, basically needs to be reallocated so that we will have better investment in these 4 areas that you spoke of: food, education, health, and transport. But now these 4 areas, now you spoke saying that they are important areas, but they're also very basic areas, aren't they? I mean, food, education, health, and transport. These are the very basic infrastructure and other aspects that any nation needs. But instead we have been spending on, I think even recently there was a controversy where the last government had spent billions on some Air Force jets. And the question was, well, for what? And apparently we are locked into that agreement and we have to keep spending on those. So it's misallocation, isn't it? Because now we have governments which keep saying there's not enough money. But I put it to you that it's not enough money, but misallocation of the funds that we do have.
I think it's both. We don't have enough money because, I mean, we are all familiar with the whole tax issue which is happening, and this is also something which we have consistently raised, is that the institutions which can be taxed, the institutions which ought to be paying tax, have been evading taxes, have not been paying taxes, and that also has caused immense burden on the treasury. So that is one thing that has to be addressed. But expenditure and allocation, misallocation is the other problem. Now this government came in and they did cut down on, for instance, expenses on individual ministries and so on, which is a very welcome thing. In terms of monies which they are allocating to, for instance, ministers and parliamentarians and so on, there is a debate on it whether, the money which this government has allocated is a decent wage or decent amount of salary for. So there is a debate on it. I won't get into that. But it is commendable that this government has come and cut down on extravagant expenses which were allocated for government officials and ministries and so on. But leaving that aside, there are these elephants in the room. One is military expenditure. And the reason why I think consecutive governments do not want to touch or touch that subject is that the military itself is a very sensitive issue in countries like Sri Lanka, with the whole war which happened and ended, war connected to patriotism and so on. So consecutive governments do not want to touch this issue because it's seen as if you touch the military, it's like you're being not patriotic. So I think that is also one of the reasons.
But is that really the main reason? Let me suggest to you that there is another reason, which is that successive governments used the military, the armed forces, in order to keep the public down, keep the public in line. There was always this the threat of military force was always kept hanging over the people.
That also.
I would put it to you that successive governments, presidents, prime ministers, cabinets, they wanted to have some soldiers who were happy with the government and would do the bidding of the politicians.
That is exactly right. That also. That a government is also thinking of, it's very interesting, right? You come to power with the vote of the people. But once you come to power, you do everything to protect yourself from the people.
You repress the people.
You repress the people, and you literally you're building battalions to protect yourself from the people. And it is not only military. It's even, I'm glad you brought this issue up because you're also talking about PTA now. Their successive governments have come and said, we're going to repeal PTA, including this government. But the moment the government comes to power, that's the first thing they do. They use the PTA and repress people. So it's, I suppose these are the fault lines of the state structures we have in today's world. But yes, military expense is a very sensitive, it's not only a sensitive topic, but it's also a question of political will. Where do you get the money? One of the places where you can get the money is from military expenditure. And very few governments are willing to take on the challenge and to really look into it.
Interesting. And we will see what this government does with the military budget. And of course, the reallocation of funds to other budgets, for example, education. Sri Lanka has one of the lowest percentages of budgetary allocation for education throughout the world. So something like 1.5%
in South Asia.
So that's terrible. And of course, if a country which doesn't invest in education is basically destroying its own future, and of course we've seen that happen. That's where we are right now, where we can't find knowledge workers.
I think when we speak about investments, and this is also something which we consistently talk about, is that we spend a lot of money on our revenue paying interest. With it, the bond issue which is happening, right? So next year, rather this year, we have to pay around 1.85 billion US dollars in terms of bonds, in terms of interest payments and so on. So when you pay for a country, for a small economy like Sri Lanka, when that amount of money is being paid out of our coffers, then obviously we are squeezing ourselves as to where we are going to invest, and all these misallocations are used and all these private interests are coming in and so on. So if we want to come out of if you want to talk about wages, for instance, or if you want to talk about military expenditure, or if you want to talk about even institutions like the IMF, which was not created to look after countries like Sri Lanka. IMF and the World Bank was created at a time when the European economies were in a shamble, and they needed an architecture to revive the European economy, which in itself is a colonial economy. European countries, we know the history of colonialism. So we are still relying on colonial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, and hoping that these institutions, their policy would revive our country. But time and time again, this is the 17th time we're going to the IMF, right? So time and time again, this has shown that this is not going to be the permanent solution for Sri Lanka. So this government has a historic mandate. They have a 2/3 majority in parliament, and that mandate has to be taken with goodwill on the side of the government. So far, maybe it's too early to say this. Maybe the government is, the early days, but the government needs to recognize that the people have given this historic mandate to the government. And this is a moment where we can actually rethink the economy of the country, the social structures of the country, the politics of the country. And in order to do that, we need honest members of parliament. We need honest members of the government. Honesty in the sense, not in terms of taking money and bribing and so on. That the government is cleaning very well. But in terms of honesty, in terms of politics, which I do not think, I have not seen that in the government, because so far what I've seen is that the government is very defensive. When criticisms come, the members have been very defensive. But I don't think the government needs to be defensive. They have to be open to ideas, to take in people forward in their journey. And the president has in fact said that in his New Year's Day speech, which is a welcome thing. But I hope that the government sticks to the words which has been spoken in the last several days. I mean, there is a lot of talking, but now we need to see action.
Now, Swastika, when you think of countries like India, Malaysia, Singapore, and so on, they have a clear vision of where they want to be economically in 1 year's time, 2 years' time, 5, 10. Singapore, for example, has such plans which they constantly revisit and adapt to the global scenarios. But here in Sri Lanka, we seem to just jump from one whim or fancy to another without having a proper plan. And of course, a plan for the nation, for the economy, has to be communicated. All Sri Lankans need to know this is where we are heading. Are we going to be, for example, tourism? In 5 years' time, what is expected of the tourism industry? And that should be just, okay, we need to have 5 million tourists by 5 years' time, but what percentage of our workforce should be working in the tourism industry at that point? I mean, these are the targets, so that young men and women would know, okay, I'll have more prospects in the tourism industry, or maybe it's shipping or banking or apparel. So we don't know basically what we want to be in a year or 2 or 5 years. Shouldn't this be a priority for the government?
The government any government can never work towards a long-term plan as long as they are captured by elite interest. And that has always been the problem in Sri Lanka, and that is what the Aragale was about. We were saying 225, go home, Gota, go home and all, but this was also a struggle against a status quo which is captured by the elite. And of course, we got rid of the political elite, the traditional political elite and so on. But this government, for instance, what we are seeing, it is being slowly captured by the business elite, and it's reflecting the interests of the business elite. And the business elite do not care about the well-being of the country. I mean, it is about profits, right? Profit over people. That is what we are seeing in Sri Lanka. So that is what I keep going back to, this word, political will. The government must recognize that the private sector in any country, and particularly in countries, small economies like Sri Lanka, is self-serving. They are there to obtain profit. So if you are going to take the advice of the private sector in order to build a long-term policy project for Sri Lanka, that is not going to be in the interest of all people. So that is why we always push the government to have a balanced interest. Talk to the private sector, talk to the workers, talk to the trade unions, talk to social movements, talk to farmers, talk to fishers. I'll give you an example. The government recently put out a cabinet paper saying that they're going to bring the new Fisheries Act. Now, the new Fisheries Act, when was brought by Ranil Wickremesinghe government, was opposed by all fishers, north, south, all fishers opposed the Fisheries Act because it was against the interest of small-scale fishers who are the main fishing community in this country. So, why did the government suddenly bring in kind of like an indecent rush to bring this Fisheries Act without consulting with any fishers in this country who are people who are actually going to the sea? So, this is what I say, the capturing of the government by certain corporate interests and certain elite interests and so on. So, if the government wants to have a long-term policy plan, then the government has to have the political will to recognize. I mean, I'm not saying antagonize the private sector, you're not going to get anywhere because we are a market economy. But what I'm saying is the government needs to recognize that the corporate interest and the private interest is not necessarily the interest of the general public. It is not necessarily the interest of the entire country or the country in another 10 or 20 or even 30 years. If the government recognizes that, then it's going to bring in different stakeholders and then we're going to have a long-term economic journey. But I don't see that even with this government. And once again, putting a caveat and saying we need to give this government time. But from what I see right now, the government seems to be taking certain interest over the interests of the large public.
Now, let me put this question in another way. For any industry in Sri Lanka, or almost any industry, they seem to stagnate. Let's take fisheries. So, for decades, we have had, you get the small-time fishermen who go out for the day. You get the multi-day fishing boats, and that's it. So, even 30 years ago, this was the status quo. We haven't actually advanced. Why is that?
So, this is a very, I'm glad you asked that because fishing is an area where we can invest. This is an area where we can invest, and this is an area where people will be willing to come and invest because we have the resources here. And when I say invest, I don't mean foreign companies coming and, amassing profits. That's not what I mean. There were times when we had investments in fisheries where our local fishers, our small scale fishers, even our multi-day fishers benefited and grew with that investment, which of course stagnated later on. Not the investment, in terms of investments, the discussion on investments. So this is something which the government can really focus on. Our fishing industry is behind. But when we talk about investments, and I always say this, we have to keep the interests of small scale fishers at the heart of because that is where the income distribution is going to come. If you're just going to come and bring in corporates and they are going to just amass profits, then the profit is going to leave the country and our people will not benefit. So investments have always have to start from small scale fishers. And I am not saying this. United Nations agencies are saying this. Development agencies are saying this. So I think the government must take advice from people who have studied this. We have very good fisheries departments in the universities. We have expertise. We have experts who have written about it. Those reports are gathering dust somewhere. I have sat in certain expert committees in terms of the fisheries ministry and so on. None of those recommendations we put forward in terms of trawling, in terms of fisheries disputes, in terms of illegal fishing mechanisms have been implemented. So this is something which the government can really think of. In terms of fishing, the government has to also think of resolving the whole trawling issue which is happening in the northern seas of this country. I don't think the government handled it well when the president went on a recent visit to India. But this is something which has to be resolved because apart from the fact that it is affecting livelihoods, it is also the neighboring country bullying us. And, that should not be the case. I mean, if India is a friendly state, then it should not be bullying the weakest of us, the fishermen in this country.
Right. And again, when it comes to disputes like this, the fisheries, we are once more trying to reinvent the wheel as though India and Sri Lanka are the only neighboring countries with maritime boundaries. So we have not studied what's going on in other parts of the world. For example, how do countries in Southeast Asia deal with it, or countries in South America. How do they deal with these? These are, after all, minor conflicts which have blown out of proportion because they haven't been resolved. So that's food for thought, and it seems to take up a lot of the time of India-Sri Lanka relations. And we are almost out of time, but one final question. What do you see as the role of India when it comes to our economic progress? In the sense, not just in investing money into Sri Lanka, but the synergies of industry between India and Sri Lanka.
India is the regional big player. So I don't think any government can ignore that regional big player. We have to take that power into account in our policies. But when the IMF came in, one of the things we said is, yes, IMF, policy issues, problems with power and all of that is there. But we need to go with a proposal. We need to go with a plan. We can't go to IMF and say, you give us a proposal, we would accept it. And that is what the previous government did. Similarly, if we want to build a relationship with India, we have to take into fact that this is not an equal power relation. India is the regional superpower and we are a small country. So that is always going to be there. But when we build a relationship with India, we need to know what we want out of that relationship. We should not just go into a meeting with the Indian Prime Minister and hope that he would act in the best interest of Sri Lanka. India is not going to act in the best interest of Sri Lanka. They are going to act in the best interest of India.
Which is quite understandable.
So we need to know what we want out of our relationship with India. And that is something which I think this government, we need to give this government to learn. I don't think we got the best out of our visit in India when the president went to India on this time around.
Well, it is early days, so
yes,
as you said, let's give this government more time, but the budget which is coming up will be crucial. And I'm afraid we are out of time ourselves. My thanks to Swasthika Arulingam, who is always a person with a lot of ideas about workers and the economy. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Dinesh.
And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. Have a good evening.